Imagine if I suggested that foolishness isn't merely a lack of smarts, but something much more sinister, a power that can turn sharp minds into tools of ruin. What if the biggest danger to society isn't wicked individuals committing atrocities, but regular folks who've simply ceased to think? Envision this. A celebrated scholar with numerous academic accolades begins to believe and propagate hazardous falsehoods. A kind-hearted educator starts promoting damaging beliefs. A caring parent makes choices that put their own kids at risk. These aren't wicked individuals. They're smart, well-intentioned people who've succumbed to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer termed the influence of foolishness. And here's the truly frightening part. It's not occurring to others. It's happening to individuals just like you and me. This isn't mere philosophical musing. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted his notorious compliance tests at Yale University. Regular participants were told by an authority figure to give what they thought were increasingly agonizing electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing cries of pain, 65% of subjects administered shocks they believed could be fatal. These weren't sadists or the mentally unstable. They were everyday people who had momentarily given up their ability for independent moral judgment. This is precisely what Bonhoeffer observed firsthand in Nazi Germany, leading him to develop one of the most unsettling theories about human nature ever conceived. But before we delve deeper, I must ask, have you ever caught yourself believing something simply because everyone around you did too? Keep that question in mind as we explore what might be one of the most crucial psychological insights of the modern age. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't your typical thinker, isolated in an ivory tower contemplating abstract concepts. He was a German Lutheran pastor who saw his entire community change before his eyes. Born in 1906 into a scholarly family, his father was a notable psychiatrist and neurologist. Bonhoeffer had every reason to believe in the power of education and rational discussion. But as the Nazi Party gained power, Bonhoeffer witnessed something that shattered his faith in human rationality. He saw his fellow Germans, educated, cultured, religious people, begin to support policies and leaders that contradicted everything they claimed to believe. These weren't uninformed masses manipulated by clever propaganda. These were professors, doctors, clergy members, and intellectuals actively participating in their own intellectual surrender. From his prison cell in 1943, awaiting execution for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote what would become his most haunting observation: "Against foolishness we are powerless. Neither protests nor force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears." What made this observation so chilling wasn't just its context, but its precision. Evil, he noted, always carries within itself the seed of its own downfall. It creates unease, resistance, and eventual collapse. But foolishness believes it's doing good, making it absolutely immune to correction. Perhaps Bonhoeffer's most profound insight was about how foolishness serves existing power structures. Malicious people know they're doing wrong, which creates internal conflict and eventual breakdown. But people caught in functional foolishness believe they're doing good, making them absolutely resistant to correction. This isn't accidental. Those in power don't need to actively suppress information anymore. They just need to create conditions where processing information honestly becomes prohibitively difficult. When Bonhoeffer used the word foolishness, he wasn't talking about low IQ or lack of education. He was describing something far more complex, what we might call functional foolishness or willful ignorance. In his letters from prison, he explained, "The fact that the foolish person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him." Here's what made Bonhoeffer's theory so groundbreaking. He argued that foolishness often emerges not from individual failings, but from systemic pressures that make thinking independently both difficult and costly. The truth is, our economics systems actively incentivize intellectual shortcuts. Social media platforms make billions when users react emotionally rather than think critically. News outlets get more clicks with outrage than nuance. Politicians win elections with simple slogans rather than complex policy proposals. When people are working multiple jobs, drowning in debt, and constantly bombarded with information, intellectual surrender becomes a survival strategy. What economists call rational ignorance emerges. It becomes more efficient for individuals to remain uninformed about complex issues than to invest the time and energy required for genuine understanding. But this individual rationality creates collective irrationality, exactly the dynamic Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany. The result isn't just individual choice, it's structural pressure toward intellectual surrender, and our brains, stressed and overwhelmed, are perfectly designed to comply. Consider the story of John, a dedicated teacher who spent his evenings tutoring underprivileged students. Despite his commitment to education and critical thinking, John found himself sharing misinformation on social media during a heated political campaign. He wasn't malicious, he was exhausted and overwhelmed. The constant barrage of information and the emotional toll of his work made it easier to share posts that aligned with his emotions rather than his rational beliefs. John's story illustrates how even the most well-intentioned individuals can fall prey to functional foolishness. While economic systems push us toward intellectual shortcuts, our brains are actually wired to comply. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s showed exactly how this works psychologically. When people encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, their brains fight to reject it. But here's what Bonhoeffer understood that modern psychology has confirmed. This process is amplified when people are stressed, overwhelmed, or economically insecure, exactly the conditions our current systems create. Bonhoeffer observed that foolishness often emerges in group settings. Writing, it becomes clear that foolishness is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one. He noticed that perfectly rational individuals would abandon their critical thinking abilities when they became part of a larger group or movement. This insight was decades ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s demonstrated exactly what Bonhoeffer had witnessed. When surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of people will go along with the crowd at least once, even when they know the group is wrong. Now imagine how this plays out in our digital age. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that make this transformation easier than ever. A 2018 study by MIT researchers found that false information spread 6 times faster than true information on social platforms. But here's the crucial insight. It's because false information often feels more emotionally satisfying than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that confirms their worldview, they're participating in a system that rewards intellectual shortcuts over careful analysis. The algorithm feeds them more of the same, creating echo chambers that act like intellectual quicksand. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to show you exactly what you want to see? That's not an accident. It's the architecture of chosen ignorance in action. We see this pattern play out repeatedly throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't conducted by evil people, but by God-fearing community members who genuinely believed they were protecting their neighbors. The Red Scare of the 1950s wasn't driven by malicious actors, but by patriotic Americans who sincerely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, intelligent, educated people abandoned critical thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional certainty. If our brains and systems are rigged against us, how do we fight back? Bonhoeffer believed that breaking free from foolishness requires what he called costly grace, the willingness to think independently even when it's painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But now we understand we're not just fighting social pressure, we're fighting millions of years of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts. On an individual level, we can cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and potentially wrong. This means actively seeking out information that contradicts our beliefs, not to torture ourselves, but to test whether our beliefs are worth holding. Here are some concrete practices that can serve as your daily resistance against intellectual surrender. First, practice intellectual friction. Set aside time each week to read thoughtful arguments from people who disagree with you, not to change your mind necessarily, but to test whether your convictions can withstand scrutiny. Second, embrace productive ignorance. When you find yourself absolutely certain about something, ask what evidence would change your mind. If you can't think of any, that's a red flag. Third, slow down your sharing. Before posting anything online, take 60 seconds to verify it from an independent source. That brief pause can break the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our emotional reactions. Finally, practice saying, "I don't know," when you actually don't know something. In a world that rewards confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting gaps in your knowledge becomes a radical act. Consider the story of Maria, a nurse who made it a habit to question her own beliefs and seek out opposing viewpoints. During a contentious debate about healthcare policies, Maria spent time reading arguments from both sides, consulting experts, and reflecting on her own biases. This practice not only deepened her understanding of the issue, but also strengthened her ability to engage in meaningful conversations with colleagues and patients. Maria's commitment to intellectual humility allowed her to navigate complex issues with confidence and compassion. But individual practices aren't enough. We also need structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding. This means requiring social media platforms to disclose their algorithmic biases and how they curate content. It means funding comprehensive public media literacy campaigns that teach people how to evaluate sources and evidence. It means designing online platforms that reward intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most importantly, we need economics, policies that reduce the stress and uncertainty that make people vulnerable to intellectual shortcuts. When people aren't constantly worried about healthcare, housing, and employment, they have more mental bandwidth for careful thinking about complex issues. Bonhoeffer's theory was brilliant for its time, but here's what he couldn't have known. This isn't just about moral surrender or social pressure. Modern neuroscience reveals something far more unsettling. Our brains are literally wired to fall into functional foolishness. Think about it. Bonhoeffer witnessed Nazi propaganda spreading through newspapers and radio broadcasts. But we're living through something exponentially more dangerous. We've gone from Nazi propaganda to social media algorithms that know exactly which psychological buttons to push. And now we're entering the age of AI deepfakes that can fabricate reality itself. The threat isn't just escalating, it's targeting the very architecture of human cognition. This isn't just about Nazis or propaganda, it's about the wiring of your brain. Our minds evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, and to seek information that confirms what we already believe. These were survival features that helped our ancestors make quick decisions when hesitation meant death. The scariest part? We're all vulnerable, no matter how smart we think we are. The mechanism is exactly what Bonhoeffer described. When people feel threatened and uncertain, they become more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations that reduce complexity to simple narratives. But here's the crucial insight that makes Bonhoeffer's warning more urgent than ever. We're not just dealing with human manipulation anymore. We're facing systems designed by artificial intelligence to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is being analyzed and weaponized against our capacity for independent thought. We saw this play out in real time during COVID-19. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with demonstrated analytical abilities, began sharing debunked theories about vaccines and treatments. These weren't failures of intelligence. They were failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented pressure. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence. He was executed by hanging on April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His last words, according to a fellow prisoner, were, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice wasn't just about political resistance, it was about defending the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking independently, they stop being fully human. They become, in his words, puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment. But here's what makes Bonhoeffer's final challenge so relevant today. Who stands fast? When the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when thinking independently requires courage, when the cost of truth is higher than the price of comfortable lies, who stands fast? The answer isn't found in superior intelligence or education. It's found in the daily choice to remain curious rather than certain, to seek truth rather than comfort, to think carefully rather than react quickly. These aren't heroic acts, they're ordinary practices that become extraordinary when everyone around you has stopped doing them. The tragedy is that intellectual surrender often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It's uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It's painful to admit you might be wrong about something important. But Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of remaining human. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think for ourselves becomes a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. We're all susceptible to functional foolishness. The moment we think we're immune, we've already begun to succumb. The price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when thinking becomes difficult. Bonhoeffer's theory of foolishness is unsettling precisely because it's so accurate. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believing obviously false things, educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions, well-meaning citizens supporting policies that contradict their own values. The problem isn't that people are getting less intelligent, it's that our systems increasingly reward intellectual shortcuts over careful thinking. But within this sobering diagnosis lies genuine hope. If foolishness is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. If it's partly structural, structures can be changed. If it's the result of cognitive overwhelm, we can create conditions that make thinking easier rather than harder. Think of critical thinking like physical exercise. It's uncomfortable at first, but essential for strength. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon without training, we can't expect to navigate complex information without practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles required for independent thought need regular use, or they atrophy. Consider the story of a community that came together to promote critical thinking and intellectual humility. They organized regular debates, invited speakers with diverse viewpoints, and created safe spaces for open dialogue. Over time, the community members developed a shared commitment to questioning their own beliefs and seeking out evidence-based information. This collective effort not only strengthened their individual abilities to think critically, but also fostered a culture of intellectual courage and mutual respect. The next time you find yourself absolutely certain about something, the next time you catch yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without consideration, the next time you feel the comfort of having all the answers, remember Bonhoeffer's warning. Functional foolishness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers that you already know everything you need to know, and in that moment of recognition, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind for the comfort of certainty, or will you choose the more difficult path of intellectual independence?